Today's chapter for World Book Day, chapter 11, is called Newton. Where have you been? Uncle Max called down the stairs. I was beginning to worry. Darcus beckoned Virginia and Bertolt into the flat. Nowhere much, he replied, climbing the stairs to the living room. Nowhere, eh? Uncle Max appeared in the doorway. That's often a very interesting place. He stopped, seeing Virginia and Bertolt. Oh, hello. I'm Darcus's uncle, Professor Maximilian Cuttle. He held out his hand. Pleased to meet you. Bertolt Roberts. Bertolt shook Uncle Max's hand. Virginia Wallace. Virginia waved. We've come to help Darcus with his homework because he's new and a bit behind. Darcus shot Virginia a look. Well, that is nice. Uncle Max stepped back, smiling. Why did you say that? Darcus said to Virginia under his breath as they filed past Uncle Max into the living room. You want to tell him what we've really been doing? Darcus shook his head. Virginia gave him a knowing smile. Thought not. Come in. Oh, and I see Baxter's with you too. Darcus, you didn't take the Beetle to school? Of course not. Good. Uncle Max clapped his hands together. Well now, isn't this lovely having guests? He beamed. Eh, Darcus? Darcus smiled awkwardly and nodded. Virginia dropped to her knees in front of her ship made from balsa wood, trapped inside a glass bottle. You've got some cool stuff, she said to Uncle Max. Why, thank you, Virginia. That's very kind of you. Uncle Max looked delighted. Most of these old things I found on my travels. He waved at the assortment of curiosities scattered around the living room. It's a hodgepodge collection, but I like it. It reminds me of where I've been. Bertolt sat down cross-legged on the floor beside a purple hookah pipe. Look, I'm the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland. He pretended to suck on the pipe and blow out a smoke ring. Virginia laughed and Darcus smiled at Uncle Max. But Uncle Max wasn't looking at him. He was frowning and edging his way towards Bertolt, peering down into the mass of his white blonde curls. Don't move, lad, he said. There appears to be a rather large bug in your hair. Not again, Bertolt wailed, dropping the pipe. Why do they like my hair so much? Don't panic, Darcus said, leaning forward. It's a firefly. A big one, Virginia added, with a belly like a burning coal. A firefly? Bertolt looked up, trying to see. Oh, I don't mind them. They're beautiful. Shall I pick it out? Uncle Max asked. But there was no need. The firefly rose up out of Bertolt's hair, bathing his face in a golden light. Hesitantly, Bertolt held out his hand for the beetle to land. The firefly was long and thin. Its copper wing casings had gold edges and a white vertical stripe down the middle. It had a tiny face and stubbly mandibles that looked like a moustache. You wouldn't know he's a firefly when you look down at him because the light comes from his belly, Virginia said loftily. It's only when he's flying that you can see it. It's called bioluminescence. He's brilliant, Bertolt, Darcus said happily. Now we've both got beetles. I've got a beetle? Bertolt's eyes grew big. How can you tell? Look at him, Darcus said. See how his mouth is held open. He's trying to smile at you. Baxter looks at me like that sometimes. It's cute. Hello, Bertolt whispered to the firefly. My name's Bertolt. What's yours? The firefly sat still, staring up at him, smiling. Would you mind if I called you Newton? Bertolt said. He's my favourite scientist. He discovered that light was made of colours. The firefly skipped up into the air, flashing his belly. Does everyone around here have a pet beetle? Uncle Max asked, huffing. I don't, Virginia sulked. I wish I did. Why don't you get a puppy or a rabbit? They're not as cool, Virginia replied, as if Uncle Max had asked a dumb question. But he was staring at the firefly and Darcus could see he was concerned. What's wrong, Uncle Max? Nothing. I just don't understand where all these beetles are coming from. Uncle Max scratched his head. They're bigger than normal beetles and they seem, well, as if it's... Yes? Darcus leant forwards. I don't know. I'm probably imagining things. Uncle Max shook his head. Getting funny in the brain. Must be my age. He sighed. And look, in all the excitement, I've forgotten my manners. What a terrible host. What can I get you to drink? Uncle Max looked from Virginia to Bertolt. Coffee? Mint tea? Does anyone fancy a licorice stick? A mint tea would be lovely, Professor Cuttle, Bertolt said politely. Thank you. Could I have some orange juice? Virginia asked. Orange juice, right, of course. We're right out of that. Perhaps I should nip down to Mr. Patel's and get some bits and bobs. What goes well with orange juice? Biscuits, Virginia replied. Custard creams or bourbons? Darkus and Bertolt nodded. Marvellous. Well, don't let me stop you getting on with your homework. I'll pop out for supplies and deliver the refreshments forthwith. Uncle Max backed out of the door, beaming at everyone. He's nice, Virginia said when she was sure he'd gone. I've never seen a grown-up so pleased about a kid bringing friends home. She laughed. Darkus felt his cheeks grow hot and changed the subject. Why the demand for orange juice and biscuits? Well, I don't know about you, but I don't like mint tea or licorice sticks. Virginia raised an eyebrow. I prefer orange juice and biscuits. Anyway, I thought we needed to talk in private, so let's do it quickly before he comes back. She put her hands on her hips. First thing I want to know is how Bertolt got himself a beetle. She stared at him. Did you catch it? No. Bertolt looked horrified. The firefly was in the tunnel after we left Beetle Mountain. It followed us. When you ran in the shop and I talked to it a bit because... Bertolt looked at the floor. I didn't like being on my own in the dark. Talking to the firefly made me feel braver. He turned to Darkus. I lost it when you came back. I thought it had flown away, but it must have hidden in my hair. Perhaps Newton chose Bertolt like Baxter chose me, Darkus said. Virginia flared her nostrils, scowling at the idea. Darkus, Bertolt blinked. How do you talk to Baxter? I don't know, I just do. Can you teach me to understand Newton like you understand Baxter? I'm not sure. Darkus looked at his beetle crawling across the coffee table and frowned. I haven't really thought about how I do it. What is it that lets you understand what he's telling you? Can I hold Newton? Darkus asked. Of course. Bertolt offered Darkus his cupped hand. Darkus gently lifted Newton, placing the beetle on his palm and lifting him to eye level. Hello there, Newton. Nice to meet you. The firefly fluttered up and flashed his belly at Darkus. Why, thank you. Darkus nodded to the beetle, looking closely at his face and thorax. Bertolt, I think he uses his belly to communicate. Watch what he's doing with it. He turned back to the beetle. Can you flash once for yes and twice for no, he asked. The firefly flashed once. Virginia and Bertolt gasped. That's amazing! Bertolt squealed, barely able to contain his excitement. Baxter talks to me with his body, Darkus said. He shakes or nods his horn, flicks his antennae or waves his legs. If you look really closely and carefully at what the beetles are doing, you'll understand them. Bertolt was impressed. He held out his hand to take Newton back. I found a stairway in the Emporium, Virginia said, keen to talk about something else, that leads from the shop to the flat upstairs, and Darkus found a key to the Emporium shop door. We heard them talking, Darkus asked. They think I'm still tied up in Humphrey's bedroom. They plan to climb in the window, get rid of me, and then sell the beetles to Lucretia Cutter. I wonder what they'll do when they find out I'm not there, he smiled. They are so stupid, they'll probably think the beetles ate you, Virginia laughed. She looked at the wall of the book-stuffed shelves between Uncle Max's flat and the neighbours. It's weird to think that all those beetles are on the other side of that wall. I mean, how did they get there in the first place? She turned to Darkus, looking thoughtful. If Lucretia Cutter has got something to do with your dad's disappearance, and the connection between her and your dad is to do with beetles, don't you think it's weird that there's a mountain of super beetles living next door to you? Darkus frowned. He hadn't thought about it before, but it did seem an unlikely coincidence. But I've only lived here a couple of weeks, he pointed out. The beetles must have been living next door for ages. Look at the size of the mountain. How long's your uncle lived here? Bertolt asked. Oh, years, since before I was born. Could the beetles have anything to do with him? Bertolt asked. I don't know, Darkus shrugged. He does behave strangely when he's around Baxter. We should ask him, Virginia said. How do we do that without telling him we broke into next door? Darkus asked. I don't know, but you should definitely ask him more about Lucretia Cutter. If your uncle thinks she has something to do with your dad's kidnapping, that means they must know each other. He dodges my questions about her. I think there's something important he's not telling me. Like, in the museum, he told Margaret not to tell me they were going to give Dad's job to someone else. He thinks if he tells me the truth, I won't be able to handle it. That's stupid, Virginia scoffed. It's much worse not knowing. Tell me about it, Darcus sighed. Then let's try again, all of us, together. We'll do it when your uncle brings back the orange juice. As if on cue, they heard Uncle Max's key in the door downstairs. 5 minutes later, he entered carrying a tray of orange juice, biscuits and a mint tea for Bertolt. He laid it on the coffee table. Thank you for Professor Cuttle, Virginia said, picking up a glass of juice and flashing him an innocent smile. Darcus was just telling me about his dad disappearing and how you and he are going to solve the mystery. It sounds ever so exciting. Well, I wouldn't say... Bertolt and I would like to help, wouldn't we, Bertolt? Oh, yes. Bertolt nodded enthusiastically as he reached for a biscuit. Well, that's very kind of you, but... We heard all about the visit to the museum, Virginia said, talking over Uncle Max, and about Darcus finding the reading glasses, and how that lady on the sticks turned up, and it turns out Bertolt knows all about her. Don't you, Bertolt? Lucretia Cutter. Bertolt nodded again. She's in all the magazines. They call her the mad scientist of fashion. Do they now? Uncle Max looked like there was a bad smell in the room. Well, I suppose if the cap fits. But we were wondering, how did you know who she was? Virginia asked. I beg your pardon? I don't mean to be rude or nothing, Professor Cuttle, sir, but I wouldn't think you were the kind of man who'd have an eye on the catwalks and fashion magazines. Virginia, Bertolt scolded. So I was wondering, Virginia continued, when you saw Lucretia Cutter in the museum, how did you recognise her? Uncle Max's mouth fell open. He closed it. Yes, Darcus leant in. How? Do you know her? Virginia persisted, taking a bite of biscuit as she waited for him to answer. Uncle Max looked at the three children and with a great sigh sat down on the couch. Well, actually, yes, I did know her once. Was that before she was famous? Virginia shot Darcus a triumphant sideways look. Yes, it was. Uncle Max pulled at his earlobe and looked into the distance. How did you meet her? Darcus asked. Through Barty, Uncle Max admitted. He introduced us at a party. But how does Dad know Lucretia Cutter? Darcus asked. They met at university. Dad went to university with Lucretia Cutter? In a way. Uncle Max shook his head. It was a long time ago, Darcus. Your father hasn't spoken to that woman in over 15 years. Then why did she turn up at the museum? Darcus asked. And why is her name above the room that Dad disappeared from? Darcus, if I knew the answer to those questions, I would have told you already. What Darcus's dad and Lucretia Cutter did at university, Virginia said, was it to do with beetles? Uncle Max blinked as he thought about his answer. Barty's specialist field was beetles, but Lucretia Cutter was a different kind of scientist, a geneticist. I think her interest in beetles came from knowing Barty. His passion for beetles was infectious. Once he started talking about them, you couldn't help but become fascinated too. What about you? Virginia asked, leaning forwards and taking another biscuit. Did you ever have anything to do with beetles? No. Uncle Max shook his head. You've never had any beetles here in the flat then? Darcus asked. Uncle Max looked terribly uncomfortable. Oh look, we need more biscuits. He jumped up and hurried out of the room. You're right, Darcus. There's something he's not telling us, Virginia whispered. There are loads of biscuits left. He didn't explain the connection between your dad and Lucretia very well, Bertolt said. It must be more than just meeting at university and chatting about beetles. Yes, we need to find out more, Virginia nodded. And I know exactly how to do it. Darcus stood up, putting his hand into his trouser pocket and pulling out the white rectangle of card. I'll ask Novak Cutter. You're going to go to Towering Heights? Bertolt's eyes shot up. Darkus nodded. Saturday morning. Darkus! Bertolt gasped. That could be dangerous and she may not even know anything. Yes, Virginia cocked her head, but then, again, she might. And I'll bet she can tell us other stuff that will help the beetles, like why her mum really wants them. She looked at Darkus. You can't trust her, though. She's the enemy's daughter. She'll probably lie to you. She may even hand you over to her mother. I'm not frightened of her, Darkus said, bristling. If Lucretia Cutter is behind Dad's disappearance, then I want to know.